A 60-year-old man in Missouri will spend the rest of his days behind bars for killing, eviscerating, and dismembering a 33-year-old woman who was also photographed in a cage and photographed bound to a gantry crane. So she suffered an absolutely horrendous death. This is a very grim article that I'm going to read through, so full trigger warnings apply. The photos are pretty harrowing too. On Friday, James David Phelps was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after he entered an Alford plea to one count of first-degree murder in the brutal 2021 slaying of the victim Cassidy Rainwater. We're told what an Alford plea is. An Alford plea is functionally equivalent to a guilty plea in that it results in a conviction, but it allows a defendant to maintain their claim of innocence whilst conceding that the state has sufficient evidence to convict them at trial. So I'm not going to pretend that I understand all of the ramifications of what an Alford plea is, but my take on it is effectively it's a guilty plea, but somehow it protects the culprit's ego to some extent. It allows them to believe they're protecting their reputation perhaps, even though, in this case, the barbaric scumbag James David Phelps has been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which I applaud. I would go for the death penalty if that were available. That's a personal preference, but certainly life in prison is the second best option, and that is very well supported when the possibility of parole is removed. So I applaud that. Of course, the sentence will give a little comfort for the family and friends of the victim, Cassidy Rainwater, but will never really bring true justice. I'll say at this point that I do hope that the fellow inmates of this barbaric scumbag James David Phelps and also the guards take it upon themselves to spend some quality time with this evil POS, to have nice little cozy chats, give him a good old welcome into whatever institution he finds himself in. Make sure that the other inmates, the guards, are able to express their feelings on how he treated Cassidy Rainwater. Murdered, eviscerated, dismembered. I don't really want to spell out what that means, but it's as gruesome as it can be. Going back to the article, James David Phelps' alleged co-defendant Timothy Leroy Norton has pleaded not guilty to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and abandonment of a corpse. He is awaiting trial at this point. A trial is imminent for James David Phelps' co-defendant Timothy Leroy Norton, who is facing charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and abandonment of a corpse. So essentially, he is believed to have been involved, heavily involved, in the tragic murder of Cassidy Rainwater. Cassidy Rainwater was last seen alive in July 2021. She was first reported missing August 2021. Investigators were able to track one of her last known locations as Phelps's home, located in Moon Valley in Lebanon, Missouri, which is around 170 miles southeast of Kansas City. When speaking with detectives, Phelps initially said that Cassidy Rainwater had been staying with him until she got back on her feet. He was helping her out. But one night, Cassidy, according to Phelps, left in the middle of the night about a month before she went missing, and that he had not seen Cassidy since that time. So he initially told detectives that he was being a good Samaritan, helping someone out. Cassidy was down on her luck. She needed somewhere to stay. The murderer, James David Phelps, was being an ever such a nice guy by allowing Cassidy Rainwater to stay with him in his home. But one night, all of a sudden, she just upped and left, according to the murderer. A break in the case came when an online tipster provided the FBI with several disturbing photographs that appeared to show Cassidy Rainwater's harrowing death, including the gruesome aftermath. Here's a quote from one of the detectives. "The photos depicted a partially clothed female in a cage, who we recognize as being Cassidy Rainwater. The other photos depicted Cassidy's body bound to a gantry crane, commonly used for deer processing, and the photo showed her evisceration and dismemberment, the complete destruction of her body, of her physical being." I'm going to interject at this point. I am very curious as to who this online tipster was. How did this online tipster get photographs of Cassidy's death and what occurred afterwards? How did the online tipster get that? Hopefully the police knows who that is, and hopefully that person has been dealt with accordingly. I mean, I don't know. I've got to presume that if you're in the possession of such photos, that you're probably up to no good in one way or another. I would imagine. Perhaps I'm wrong. Going back to the article, investigators executed a search warrant on Phelps's property. They recovered physical evidence, including the gantry device, a cage, items from the freezer that appeared to be human flesh. Skeletal remains were also confirmed to be Cassidy's, and they were located at the home next door to the murderer's residence. So the article that I've gone through hasn't told us who lives next door to the murderer. I'm wondering if it is the alleged co-defendant Timothy Leroy Norton. I'm sure that info is out there, but I'm not able to do too much research when I go through these articles. I have covered this subject before at the time that it happened, I believe, but it's been a while. Investigators also recovered digital evidence from electronic devices that authorities say included text message conversations between the murderer Phelps and the accused murderer Norton, in which they planned Cassidy's murder. The two were arrested and charged in connection with Cassidy's death. Authorities said that after his arrest, Norton confessed to the horrific spate of crimes. Here's a quote. Norton told FBI agents that Phelps had him come over whilst Cassidy was sleeping in the living room floor, and he came over at that time so he had easy access to attack Cassidy. After entering the house, Norton held Cassidy's legs down whilst the convicted murderer Phelps strangled her and placed a bag over her head. Norton stated that Phelps bound her to the Gantry crane and Phelps began the evisceration and dismemberment of Cassidy's body. Norton stated that he helped Phelps carry Cassidy's body into the house and placed her into the bathtub. I'm just going to comment on that. I am a little bit confused. So seemingly the co-defendant, Timothy Leroy Norton, has confessed to detectives in regards to his involvement, which included planning the murder as well as participating with the murder, to the extent that Norton admits to holding Cassidy's legs down whilst Phelps strangled her to death. I believe she was strangled to death. I hope she was strangled to death. I say I hope she was strangled to death because after that we're told that she was strapped to a gantry crane and eviscerated and dismembered. So I hope and pray that she was deceased at that point. So I am a little bit confused. Norton has admitted to detectives about his involvement, yet his plea is not guilty. So I don't know what his lawyer's playing at, but I too hope that he gets life in prison without the opportunity for parole. The home in which this awful, brutal, savage murder occurred burned down in October 2021, whilst both the murderer, Phelps, and the accused murderer, Norton, were in custody. So they were both in custody, and somehow the house burnt down. Investigators said that the fire was an act of arson caused by an incendiary device in a mortar tube with a tripwire attached to it. So we're not told who it is that set up that incendiary device. I guess I could presume it was the convicted murderer, Phelps, and or the co-defendant Norton, but that could be wrong. It could have been somebody else, a third party. We also know of another third party, the online tipster. I'm going to throw something out there. It's pretty awful. How entertaining was this murder? I just want to clarify what I mean by that. I don't want to be misconstrued, but it just seems that there are a whole host of people aware of, involved in this dreadful, dreadful murder, which is clearly planned out and absolutely horrific. Some might even say satanic. There were photographs of the murder. My interpretation of what's said within this article is that there are photographs of the murder taking place as well as the aftermath of the murder. So I use the word entertainment. I don't mean this entertains us, but I am questioning whether or not this murder was for the entertainment of others. An online tipster had access to the photos. How did they get access? Presumably they were sent the photos, presumably by the convicted murderer Phelps and or the accused murderer Norton. I mean, they're both going to be convicted, I'm sure. Or another third party. Hopefully my point is coming across well. It just seems that this was entertainment, or could have been, to kill someone in this just barbaric way, just ridiculously barbaric, savage way, and have a record of it, photos of perhaps various stages of this awful situation. Having Cassidy Rainwater locked in a cage outside, we see photos of that, bound to a gantry crane. I mean, it's just something out of a Hollywood movie, isn't it? And I'm wondering if the fact that an online tipster had multiple photographs of the murder and the aftermath, then I'm just thinking that this was a staged event. I'm not saying not a real event. event, I'm saying an absolutely real event, but staged for the purposes of providing photographs and perhaps video to third parties, and in that way entertainment. Hopefully my words aren't too offensive. I'm going to wrap things up at this point. Of course, full condolences to the family and friends of Cassidy Rainwater. It's an absolutely horrific, gruesome situation. I'm sure it's rocked the town of Moon Valley, the city of Lebanon. I'm sure most normal, sane people there are disgusted that their neighbors can act in this way, have acted in this way. I'm glad that Phelps has been given life in prison without the possibility of parole. I hope that's the same for Norton. Norton, the co-defendant, has admitted to detectives of his involvement, yet is pleading not guilty. Makes no sense to me. I would like for the investigation to get to the bottom of whether or not there were other parties involved as recipients of photographs or video. This online tipster, that person needs to be found and investigated. If this is part of a dark web group, it needs to be rooted out. So anyhow, I'm going to wrap things up. If you appreciate the coverage, please do like, comment, subscribe, and take care.